in my 70 odd years plus, I've seen a few floods. We were taught the dangers of a flood, not to go down to the river when the flood season was in its peak period. We always stayed away from there. We didn't even bother to set the nets with my grandfather. A big factor with floods in this river, in the Shoalhaven River, is if Shoalhaven Edge is closed and tidal. And you get a lot of water back up the creeks and that there. And you see Albatross Road, all those places are closed, Queensland, because of the tide factor. Once that tide's on the run out, that tidal floodplain will just release itself then. And the only outlet for that was down through Shoalhaven Edge. Once I see that water backing up on Albatross Road and up around Ben's Walk, that'll give you a good indication of the flood to be expected. You've got to be really on your guard when you're in the river, especially in flood time. We sense danger, and if we know that's a dangerous spot to go to, we'll keep away until such time as the flood abates. Because flood also with us, going back to the 50s, 60s, when the only source of employment for Aboriginal people was seasonal work, picking peas and beans and corn, if we got a flood then, that more or less decimated the Aboriginal people earning any money. And that was a real knock-take of that. And one big thing too with floods, it washes out the snakes. Snakes are in abundance when there's floods about. And you have to watch if you picked up anything there where a snake can crawl inside, you have to be very, very careful, especially with drums and that. Snakes can get into that. But now with the damming of the two rivers, it's not going to harm our sites along the river. But I always respect the river in there because the sustenance, it's got food for you. So the older people knew what was coming. That some of them had another sense where they can pick all that. And my mum used to always say that's the old clever black fella coming out in them.
We grew up walking across the river when every flood came, and you'd see the cattle, dead cattle going down and logs, and if you've lived here all your life, I think you sort of knew when this was getting underwater and that was underwater. Like the recent ones they had. See, really Riverview Road is quite prone. Well, we knew the night we had 10 inches in the one night that was going to have repercussion, yeah, because they'd have had that up at Nerriga as well. It's not as bad as it was in the 1800s, I would think. We had a paddock of pumpkins at one stage, I remember, and the flood came up and the pumpkins floated up the creek and then they floated back down the creek. Obviously, if it goes through your house, that is very traumatic, and worse if you can't get out of danger, which would be terribly frightening. If you lived in Nowra for a long while, you had a pretty fair idea of where it was going to flood. It's like the farmers. They know when they have to get out because there's so many houses everywhere now that people don't really think it's ever going to happen. So I would say the recent floods took a lot of people by surprise because we've had a pretty good time, and there's been houses in the last or even 10, 20 years. People have just built where supposedly they were safe, but you can never be real sure, can you?
Oh, I think it can be enormously disruptive, particularly back in history as I've studied, because people weren't able to cope with it. I've looked extensively at Terrera, which was the major town around here in the 1860s and up until 1870, and they got regular floods, and it was just changed their whole lifestyle, so that the school was cancelled and the shops got inundated, and all the public buildings, they mostly underwater, but when they got the big floods, like in 1860 and 1870, well, there were buildings washed into the river and carried away, and there was loss of life, and it was a traumatic experience for them. Braidwood's a good sounding point because it's in the upper reaches of the Shoalhaven River, and if there's a lot of rain up there, well, it's going to cause lots of water to be coming downstream, and naturally if there's a couple of days of continuous rain, well, it's going to build up everywhere along the way. And later in the 70s, well, they came to the conclusion that the levee bank needed to be built near Riverview Road, and council went ahead and did that, and so there hasn't been the same drama since. The community impact, to some people it was just the last straw, and quite a lot of people left Terera, quite a few came to Nowra and set up again here, whereas others moved up to the north coast and far away. It was just the end of it all for them. So there were lists of families who left Terera and never to return. So that was why it called the flood that changed Nowra, was because of the impact it had on the community.
Oh, well, it's usually pretty devastating. It's always a lot of trauma, and you've really know that once you get through the flood, there's always major consequences, because a lot of the time our farm's covered in mud, and you've got to really replant everything, and your months hand feeding then. So there's major dramas. When the river starts to run, it's absolutely raging, and you've got to be very careful and very aware of the power and the volume of water that's going past. It's quite horrific. The recent flood, I had to actually check the weather site and Elders weather site and looked at it, and realised that Tallowa Dam was already 100% full, and I knew straight away that we were going back to the old style flood where it could come up very quickly, and that's exactly what happened. It caught a lot of people by surprise. The force of water is absolutely phenomenal. Like, I've had huge big corner posts washed clean out of the ground, fences washed for kilometres across the paddocks, and it's such a huge process just to clean up afterwards. And even houses, with mud all through them. And one farmer in particular, he'd been all day working with his cattle, getting them to high ground, and when he went home, the water was all right through his house as well. I don't think there's any real connection with climate change, because going right back to the 50s and 60s, there was always continual flooding, and it's just been a constant thing. Looking back at records, every 10 years we've had a fairly major flood, and it just seems to be part of nature.
Riverwatch is concerned with improving the health of the Shoalhaven River by working with landowners and farmers in various activities, including bank restoration work, planting vegetation, and also monitoring the health of the river with the oyster farmers as well. The 1988 flood, where I was living at Longreach, came up probably about 1 to 2 metres higher than this flood, but this flood seemed to cause a lot more damage than we've experienced previously. We only moved to Longreach in 1987, so 1988 was our first experience of flood. So we didn't get any warning that a flood was going to happen, and we got a little bit surprised at how quickly the water would come up. There are telltale signs, which we've learnt now, of when you're going to get a flood in that part of the river. But we found that the flood was quite horrific. A lot of debris was dropped on the side of the river. There was a lot of silt that was also deposited along the banks of the river. The last flood had impacts on parts of the banks that we didn't have in the 1988 flood, and that came as quite a surprise. But I think the biggest shock was the amount of debris coming down the river, including dead cows. I've never seen dead cows floating down a river before. I believe the council's role in opening the Shoalhaven Heads is pretty well managed, but currently that is being readdressed and have a look at to see if there is a better way of opening up that channel either earlier or making the notch deeper. And there's current discussions going on with the Shoalhaven task force down there. I think what we've got available today is the real-time monitoring of the river levels in the Shoalhaven. We've never had that before. It's available now online. So I think if you've got access to a computer and get that data, I think that would be very, very helpful.